Have you ever looked around at the people in your life and felt not superior, not arrogant, but simply different? Like you are watching the world from a slightly different angle than everyone else. Like the conversations that consume the people around you leave you cold. Like the things they chase with such desperate urgency, the approval, the comfort, the neat and socially acceptable life feel to you like a cage that everyone else is calling a home. And you have wondered, in the quiet moments that nobody else sees, whether something is wrong with you, whether the distance you feel is a defect, whether the inability to simply fit to want what everyone else wants, to be satisfied with what everyone else settles for is a sign that you are broken, rather than becoming. It is not a defect. It is the price of depth. It is the cost of vision. It is the specific, necessary, completely misunderstood loneliness of the person who is growing in a direction that the people around them have not yet chosen to go. Friedrich Nietzsche said, "The higher we soar, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly." Not the higher we climb, the higher we soar. Because climbing is something you do with others. Soaring is something you do alone, and the person watching you from the ground does not see someone ascending. They see someone disappearing. They see someone becoming strange, becoming difficult, becoming the uncomfortable mirror that shows them the distance between who they are and who they could be if they were willing to pay the price. Strong people walk alone, not because they hate people, but because the path they are walking does not yet have company. Stay with me, because what you are about to understand will make the loneliness make sense for the very first time. His name was Thomas, 36 years old, a structural engineer in a mid-sized city in the American South. By every measure, the people around him used to evaluate a life he was doing well. Stable job, good salary, a house in a respectable neighborhood. The kind of life his parents had worked hard to make possible and were genuinely proud to see him inhabiting. And he was miserable, not the dramatic, visible, crisis-level misery that announces itself and gets addressed. The quiet kind, the kind that lives in the gap between the life you are living and the life you feel, pulling at you from somewhere deeper and less explainable. The kind that shows up on Sunday evenings when the week ahead looks exactly like the week behind and the week before. That in every week, stretching back as far as honest memory can reach, he had ideas. He had always had ideas about architecture that was not just structurally sound but genuinely beautiful, about the relationship between the spaces people inhabit and the quality of thought those spaces make possible. He had notebooks filled with sketches and concepts that his colleagues, if they had seen them, would not have known what to make of. He had read Nietzsche. He had read the Stoics. He had read the philosophers and the poets and the writers who were asking the questions that his actual life gave him almost no space to ask, and he was profoundly alone in this. Not physically alone, he had friends, a social life, the regular attendance at the events and gatherings that constitute connection in the way most people understand connection, but alone in the way that actually costs something, alone in his thinking, alone in his questions, alone in the specific territory his mind inhabited when it was most fully itself. He told me once, and I want you to hear this. He said, "The most exhausting thing in my life is not the work. It is the translation, the constant daily translation of who I actually am into a version that the people around me can understand and feel comfortable with. Translation is expensive. It costs you the energy you need for the real work. It costs you the authenticity that makes the real work possible, and it costs you, slowly, incrementally, almost imperceptibly, the sense that the real work matters at all." Thomas is not exceptional. Thomas is the story of every person who ever felt the specific loneliness of a mind that has outgrown its current container, of a soul that is being called somewhere that none of the people around it have been called. That story may be yours, and if it is, what you are about to hear is the permission you have been waiting for. Let me name the thing honestly. The loneliness of depth is real. It is not romantic. It is not the noble, cinematic solitude of the philosopher on the mountain or the artist in the studio. Not most of the time. Most of the time it is the ordinary, grinding, socially invisible loneliness of the person who cannot find their reflection in the eyes of the people around them. You go to the party and you come home more empty than when you left. Not because the people were unkind. They were perfectly kind. But the conversation stayed on the surface and everything in you lives below the surface. And the whole evening was a performance of connection that cost you something real and gave you nothing back. You try to share the thing that is consuming you, the idea, the question, the perspective that has reorganized how you see everything. And you watch the eyes glaze, you watch the topic change, you watch the person across from you scan the room for someone they can talk to about something more manageable, and you learn, the way all sensitive people learn, through repeated exposure to the cost of being too much. You learn to make yourself smaller, to hold the real things back, to lead with the version of yourself that the social environment can accommodate, and keep the rest, the most alive rest, the most genuine rest, in a room that you visit alone. Nietzsche knew this room. He spent most of his adult life in it. He had almost no lasting intimate companionship. He wrote about it. He described it with the specific, first-hand precision of someone who knows the territory from the inside, the specific grief of a person whose mind can reach further than their relationships can follow. This is the struggle. Not weakness, not failure, not the sign that something has gone wrong. The sign that something is going right, in the direction of depth, in the direction of genuine selfhood, in the direction of the person you are becoming. But the company has not yet caught up. Nietzsche wrote something that I want you to sit with. He wrote, one must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star, not order, chaos, the internal disorder, the tension, the irreducible complexity of a person who has not simplified themselves down to what the social world can easily categorize and accommodate, the person who contains multitudes, the person who is still in the process of becoming rather than having arrived at the comfortable plateau of a finished identity. The turning point for Thomas came the year he turned 38. He had been offered a position at a larger firm in another city, more prestige, more money, the kind of professional advancement that everyone around him immediately agreed he should take. And he sat with it. For 2 weeks he sat with it. And he realized that the question he was being asked, is this a good career move, was not the question he actually needed to answer. The question he needed to answer was deeper and more frightening and had been waiting for him much longer than this particular offer. What kind of person are you trying to become? And is the life you are living making that person more possible or less? He turned down the position. He started his own practice, small, financially risky, oriented around the specific ideas that had been living in those notebooks for years. He lost income. He lost the social validation that comes with a prestigious institutional affiliation. He gained something harder to name and infinitely more valuable. He gained the right to be himself, fully, without translation. That is the turning point, not a moment of triumph, not a dramatic reversal of fortune. The quiet, terrifying, completely private decision to stop organizing your life around what can be understood by the people around you, and to start organizing it around what is most true about who you actually are. The first lesson, solitude is not loneliness. It is the laboratory. Nietzsche made a distinction that most people have never encountered because it requires a certain kind of experience to even understand. The distinction between solitude and loneliness. Loneliness is the painful absence of the connection you need. It is a hunger, a lack, a signal from the deepest parts of yourself that something essential is missing. It is real, and it is difficult, and it deserves to be addressed rather than romanticized. Solitude is something entirely different. Solitude is the chosen, productive, generative state of being alone with yourself at full capacity. It is the condition under which the deepest thinking happens. The most honest self-examination occurs. The most authentic work gets done. It is not the absence of connection. It is the presence of yourself, fully, without the constant modulation that social life requires. Nietzsche said, I am a forest and a night of dark trees. But he who is not afraid of my darkness will find banks full of roses under my cypresses. The darkness of solitude is not emptiness. It is density. It is the specific richness of a mind that has learned to be genuinely present with itself. And the person who can be with themselves in that way, who does not need constant company and noise and stimulation to feel real, is the person who is capable of the deepest connection when connection finally occurs. Because genuine connection requires two people who are genuinely themselves, and you cannot be genuinely yourself if you have never spent time alone enough to discover who that is. The second lesson: the crowd pulls toward the average. The strong move toward the true. There is a gravitational pull in every social environment toward the mean, toward the center, toward the beliefs and values and ways of being that the majority has agreed upon, implicitly and explicitly, as the acceptable range of human expression. And this pull is not malicious. The people exerting it are not your enemies. They are people who have, consciously or not, made the trade. They have exchanged the discomfort of radical authenticity for the comfort of social belonging, and they have found, as most people find, that the trade feels worth it most of the time. Nietzsche called the person who refuses this trade the Übermensch, Abort. That has been catastrophically mistranslated and misused, but in its original meaning simply describes the person who creates their own values rather than inheriting them from the herd. The person who asks not what does society consider good, but what is actually, genuinely, deeply good, and has the courage to live by the answer even when it diverges from the consensus. This is what strong people do, not because they are better than the people around them, not because they have contempt for ordinary life, but because they have heard something that the crowd has not yet heard, a different frequency, a different calling, and they cannot unhear it. And following it means moving in a direction that the crowd, by definition, is not moving. Thomas left the prestigious firm. His colleagues thought he was making a mistake. His parents worried. The people who had been using his success as a source of vicarious satisfaction felt something that looked like concern but was also, if they had been honest, something closer to the discomfort of watching someone choose a path that implicitly questioned the one they had chosen. He moved toward the true. He walked alone. And the work he built in that aloneness was more genuinely his than anything he had produced before. The third lesson: every great thing was born in the individual before it was shared with the world. Nietzsche wrote, "In individuals, insanity is rare. But in groups, parties, nations, and epochs, it is the rule." Think about every significant idea, every genuine breakthrough, every piece of work that has added something real to the world. It began in one mind, one person, alone with their thinking, following a thread that the consensus had not yet validated. One person willing to entertain the possibility that the conventional wisdom was wrong or incomplete, or simply the product of collective comfort rather than honest inquiry. The crowd cannot produce this. The crowd produces consensus. And consensus is the enemy of the genuinely new, because the genuinely new, by definition, has no precedent in the existing consensus. It comes from somewhere the consensus has not been. It requires a mind that has been somewhere alone. Your aloneness is not the obstacle to your contribution. It is the precondition of it. The thing you see that others do not see, the perspective your particular solitude has given you, is not a burden. It is the material. It is the specific, unrepeatable, entirely yours raw material from which the thing that only you can make is waiting to be built. The fourth lesson: the people who are meant for you will find you in your depth, not your performance. Here is the thing about walking alone that Nietzsche understood and that most motivational content never says. The goal is not to remain alone. The goal is to become genuinely yourself, deeply, completely, without the constant dilution that social performance requires, so that the connections you eventually make are real ones. Connections between actual people rather than between the performances they have been trained to present. Nietzsche wrote, "A friend should be a master at guessing and keeping silence. You must not want to see everything. Your dream should tell you what your friend does with his waking hours. The friendships worth having are the ones where you do not need to translate, where the person across from you can receive you at full depth without flinching, where the silence between you is not empty, but full, where the conversation can go anywhere without the social brakes being applied every time it approaches something real. These people exist. They are rare. They are in some cases the rarest thing in a human life. But they exist, and you will find them, not by making yourself smaller so more people can fit around you, but by becoming so fully, unapologetically, precisely yourself, that the people who resonate at your frequency can find you. You walk alone until you find the person who can walk beside you without slowing you down. That is not a consolation. That is the entire point. I want to tell you about the last coherent period of Nietzsche's intellectual life. He was in Turin in the autumn of 1888, 44 years old. His body was failing. His health was collapsing. The recognition he had spent his entire life deserving had not yet arrived. He would not live to see his ideas reach the people they were written for, and in those last months, before the collapse in January, he produced some of his most extraordinary work. Ecce Homo, Twilight of the Idols, the Antichrist. He was writing with the specific urgency of a man who knew, at some level, that the window was closing, that the time to say what he needed to say was measured and finite and being spent. He wrote alone, as he had always written, in rooms in European boarding houses, without a permanent home, without a companion who could receive what he was producing at the level at which it was being offered, without the recognition that would have told him, from outside himself, that the work was worth the cost, and he kept going. Not because it was comfortable, not because the loneliness had been resolved, not because someone had finally arrived to walk beside him in the direction he was walking. He kept going because the work was true, because the ideas were real, because the alternative wanted to stop, to simplify, to make himself legible to a world that had not yet developed the capacity to receive him, was a kind of death that made the physical death irrelevant. He chose the truth over the company every single time, and I want to ask you, and not rhetorically, not as a rhetorical device, but as a genuine and urgent question, what are you choosing? Because the choice is in front of you every day, not in dramatic form, not as a single decisive moment with appropriate music, but in the 1,000 small daily choices between what is true and what is comfortable, between what your deepest self needs to do and what the social environment around you finds easiest to accommodate. Thomas built his practice. It took 5 years. It was financially precarious in ways that made him doubt the decision repeatedly. And then it was not. And the work that came out of those 5 years, the buildings, the spaces, the genuinely beautiful architecture that his soul had been building in those notebooks for a decade before the notebooks, became reality. That work is standing, physical, real, inhabited, by people who live differently because of it. He walked alone, and he built something the world needed. So did Nietzsche. A century and a half after his death, writing for you right now in a world he never lived to see. That is what the aloneness was for. Here is what I want you to do with what you have just heard. Find your notebooks, literally if you have them, the place where the real thinking lives, the ideas that are too alive and too unfinished to share with the world yet. Go back to them. Not when you have more time, now, this week. Because the work that is in those notebooks is not waiting for perfect conditions. It is waiting for you to decide that it matters enough to begin. Stop translating. Not permanently. Not completely. We all live in the world, and the world requires a certain amount of translation. But stop translating the parts of yourself that are most essential. Stop making your deepest self legible to people who have not earned the access. Let those parts breathe. Let them exist at full size, in the space of your solitude where they can grow without being shaped by the expectations of people who cannot yet understand where you are going, and trust the walk. Trust the specific, lonely, uncertain, no company yet walk in the direction that your deepest self is pointing. Not because it is easy. Not because the destination is clear. Not because someone has already walked this path and left a map, but because the alternative, the slow, comfortable, socially validated contraction into a smaller life is a cost you will pay. Forever, Nietzsche wrote. One day you will ask, what were you doing all your life? And if you had spent it becoming smaller to fit where you were put. If you had spent it translating yourself into a version the crowd could follow. What will you answer? Strong people walk alone, not because they are cold, not because they are better, not because they have given up on connection or community or the warmth of being genuinely known, because the path they are walking was made for one person at a time, and it was made for them. And to walk it with a crowd would be to walk it as someone else. Walk your path, at full depth, at full speed, in the specific direction that only you can hear. The dancing star you are. capable of giving birth to needs the chaos you are carrying. Do not organize it away. Do not simplify it into something the crowd can follow. Let it be what it is, and become who it is making you. If this reached the part of you that has been walking alone and wondering whether the path was a mistake, share it with the person you know who is translating themselves for a world that does not deserve the original. Subscribe for more philosophy that meets you in the depth rather than on the surface. And tell me in the comments, what is the thing you have been keeping in the notebook that the world has not yet seen?